of all, thank you very much, Deepak and the rest of the organizers of Agrusa for this invitation to come and speak to all of you. Special thanks to Miss Lisa for that wonderful activity which has woken me up and I think woken many of us up after a very heavy lunch. And I say this advisedly because the theme of my talk is going to be a little different from the talks we've had so far, but it I think has very, very clear connections too. We've had some very inspirational speakers in the morning speaking about their teachers, about their lives, about what they think education should be, and they've shared a lot of on-the-ground experiences on this topic. So I'm going to now, however, raise the camera high up. When you speak of philosophy of education, you have to take a very bird's-eye view of education. And that's what I'm going to try and do in this time that I have here with you. So the theme of my talk is the need for a philosophy of education for schools in the 21st century. Now, first of all, you may ask, what do I mean by philosophy of education, and how might it be different from, say, a mission statement or a vision statement, which many schools now like to put out on their websites for everyone to see. This is what we are all about. So what do I mean by philosophy of education? Is it the same, similar, or something different? Second, you may also wonder, why is it specially needed for schools in the 21st century? And I think there have been many things said today which actually point in that direction. And maybe I'll try and elucidate some of my thoughts and propositions on this topic. I'll be bringing a special focus. I come from a school which is founded by a philosopher, Krishnamurti, and I'll maybe bring a little special focus on his point of view and the point of view which I share in this talk. However, I'll start a little more generally. So I'm supposed to click this now, right? Okay, yeah. So there are many metaphors which have been used for the purposes of education, right through the ages, since the time formal education has become part of the way societies groom their young. One of the metaphors is, which has been earlier, it was a reproduction of traditions and social norms, or it was also considered as a transmission of culture. Perhaps this was true at times when society wasn't changing that much and you wanted things to continue. Continuity was valued, traditions were valued. All ancient culture societies had some forms of education of this kind. Sorry. In more recent times, as nations came into being, as countries like India gained independence and many others, schools were also seen as arenas for nation building, a certain patriotic spirit, a certain sense of the nation, who are we as a people. That was supposed to come through a kind of education which you gave the children. So that was another metaphor. And then, of course, we have had many, I would say, mostly private schools, both residential, day schools, which see themselves as providing specific opportunities for the development and progress of individuals. And of course, through individuals, you also hope that you'll make a difference to society. So development and progress has been another metaphor, very popular in the 20th century. Some schools have also claimed that they provide leadership for society. They've cultivated leaders who will make changes in society. And finally, I would say in the last couple of decades, with a kind of globalized economy coming into play and market forces operating very strongly, schools are also being seen, or sometimes seeing themselves, as service providers for this globalized economy. That you have to match up to the skills which corporations will need in the 21st century. So that's been one kind of range of metaphors which we've seen being held by schools. However, I'd like to take a little pause here, because as many speakers have spoken already about this, a lot of the models of schooling have come post-industrial revolution, first in the West, then through the British into India, and schools took a certain form and shape, and which had its own impact on how children were seen and how the effects of education on children and what that further leads to in society. So I have a short film here, which is an animation film made by a student at NID called Prasenjit Ganguly. So can we have that film on? Not what you think. Speak of creativity and imagination. And then
Now, realization of standing of the best brother and calculation of merit of the standing of the right and human being. Now, realization. Sir. Merit of the standing of the right and human being. Calculation of merit of the standing.
the scene shifts to back home. This is where that sign comes from, which we see on the roadside. I think in this short film, very different from the experiences of people who shared about their schools today, and I'm so glad that those experiences are so different. Riverside, the school we just heard about, the Steiner School, and so on. But I think in some ways this film captures very well some of the real characteristics of what modern education has been and what it has done. I think many of you would resonate with the experiences of young Prosenjit Ganguly, who made this film based on his own experiences in a school in Kolkata. Very different from Narendra's school, I guess, but also very true. Now let us have a quick look at what this film is trying to depict. On one side it has a certain view of the child, a certain feeling of what a child is all about. And you could say, one, the child is observant, curious, is active, is looking around, observing things. He's also fascinated with the natural world, with the processes of life and growth. And of course we saw he has quite a fertile imagination, both a very pleasant side as well as you saw his nightmare, which can lead you to think that you're being swallowed up by the world. He's full of questions and he enjoys the process of learning. That's the view of the child which the film is trying to show. And then it shows that when he enters school, he enters into a straight-jacketed, closed environment. He's sort of treated like a blank slate, not a living, active, thinking, feeling being. He's bombarded with information. He has to parrot it or write it out, write examinations. He's kept apart from other children, made to compete with them. The focus is on rewards and achievements. You saw how his parents were sort of looking forward to the gratification of him getting all the medals and awards and so on. And that's one unfortunate attitude which parents foist on their children, and the schools tend to respond to them. So he feels trapped, he's under pressure, he's also very fearful. And the question to be asked really is, what happens to such children as they grow up in society if they have these kinds of experiences for 10, 12 years in their lives? They grow up shrunk inwardly, they grow up fragmented inside, their relationships are affected. There are all kinds of impacts that such a thing would have. However, as we've already seen, there have been people thinking of a very different kind of education, and it's been going on for quite some time. And I'd like to share some philosophers, thinkers who have tried to bring changes in the process of education. Sorry, pressing the wrong button. Before that, a very quick word about the interaction between school and society. In some way, what the film which we saw seemed to suggest that the school itself is shaped by the forces in society. If there's competition in society, there has to be competition in school. If in society people are under pressure, well, the pressure has to be started very young. So that's one way. Society, the way it's organized, its values, its expectations, have a direct impact on school, its structures, its practices, and also, of course, its outcomes. These are the people who are going to fit into that society. And that's one way in which education has been looked at. But schools also have had their own philosophies of education, which I'm going to come to presently. And they might reconceive of how they design the educational environment. The one we just saw before this presentation was such a different environment from the one we saw in the... And there are many such schools which have come up over the last century or two. So they have different teaching learning practices. They also form new values. And when these new values are formed and these children go out into society, well, society also experiences change. Changes in values, in relationships, and outlooks. And we saw how, for example, in the Riverside School, the ways they were interacting with the outside world, even at a very young age, they were able to bring in some changes. So now let's look at some educators of the 20th century. Everyone's heard the name of Maria Montessori. Montessori had a very different view from the child as the view that was held through 19th and 20th century by many, many establishments. She saw the child as a living being who was a self-learner, who was motivated, and all you had to do was provide the right kind of environment. So the child is a self-learner, has an absorbent mind, and you need to focus really on supporting the child's growth. I think Steiner had a very similar view from what we heard in the previous presentation. Then there was Gandhi, whom someone talked about. In fact, two speakers spoke about him. And at a time when India was going through a lot of transition, there were already very many hierarchies in society, he thought of a very different kind of scheme for education, where he thought that it needed to develop the head, the heart, the hand, and prepare self-reliant individuals who could have the capacity to communicate and to live in a cooperative community. So that was his Nai Talim, his basic education, which initial governments did try to get off the ground, but it got swallowed up. There are very few such schools left now. Tagore was also there, Ron Tagore from Bengal, who had a nature-based kind of education, learning in freedom, and it taught children to grow up with a certain sympathy for all life. And of course, the whole creative, imaginative, artistic dimension was very much part of his scheme of things. And the schools in Shantiniketan and others which have been inspired by that continue to have that kind of flavor. And then there was Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who started another set of schools which intended to address all the planes of human nature. So this was a certain spiritual approach to education, where the physical, the vital, the mental, the psychic, and the spiritual all had to be cultivated. And these schools had a very different form and shape than what we saw earlier. And these schools have slowly started impacting education more widely. Now the fact that we hear much more about child-centered education, I think is largely due to thinkers and visionaries of this kind. There's also Krishnamurti, whom I'm going to speak about a little later. One more thinker who I would like to just mention very quickly. In America, John Dewey, a philosopher and an educationist, in the 1930s, between the two world wars, and I'm taking a small quotation of his from a book which he titled The Need for a Philosophy of Education, from which I have borrowed my title. I'd like to just quickly read that out. He says there are two outstanding reasons why in the conditions of the world at present, a philosophy of education must make the social aim of education the central article in its creed. The world is rapidly industrialized. Individual groups, tribes and races, once living completely untouched by the economic regime of modern capitalistic industry, now find almost every phase of their lives affected for better or worse, and often for the worse, by the expansion of that system. And he goes on to say, in a world that is so largely engaged in a mad and often brutally harsh race for material gain by means of ruthless competition, this is talking between the two world wars, and it certainly was prescient because the Second World War, which had similar and other kinds of basis, the nationalistic rise in Germany. It behooves the school to make ceaseless and intelligent organized effort to develop above all else the will for cooperation. So I'm just trying to thread my argument through a sort of broad historical perspective, and these are some of the thinkers of the 20th century who've tried to bring shifts in the whole process and purpose of education. So now I'd like to begin by answering the first question that I raised. What is the philosophy of education? And I would say there are at least three levels of this that I think need to be held in mind and to be sort of connected with each other. So the first level, I would say, a certain considered view on what is human nature, what is child's nature, what does growth mean, what are we growing towards, and also to survey and look at what are the conditions and challenges in the contemporary world that the child is going to grow into. And you of course know that the world is going to change by the time he is grown up, so what can you foresee? And people have spoken about that. Also you need to have some view or a certain position on what is the responsibility which education has to give to the child, both to himself as well as to society and to the world. So I think this kind of deeper thinking is really the beginning of a philosophy of education. And many of the thinkers we've talked about earlier began with this kind of thinking, or at least this was very much part of their scheme of things. And then from this we can derive certain broad aims of education, and from the broad aims of education emerge a certain framework of values, a certain set of values, and also views on the nature of knowledge and learning, whether it should be subject-based, whether it should be cross-disciplinary, what does learning mean. So there are many such factors which emerge from our first set of considerations. And when you put the two together, then you arrive at what should happen in a school, what we call a school, which is a learning environment. So first of all, what kind of appropriate educational environment ought we to have? What would be the relationships in school? A lot of the speakers in the morning actually focus so much on relationship that after everything is done, what you remember is how a teacher made you feel, not what she taught you or the knowledge she gave you and so on. So especially the teacher-student relationships, the ideas that you have about discipline. Is discipline something to be imposed, or is discipline something which you learn within yourself, and that's something which you are helped with. Also, what kind of a curriculum should you have? What kind of pedagogy, that is teaching, learning, assessment practices? So I think when you put all of these together, and I think that's what makes it a philosophy of education. And to conclude, I would say a philosophy of education is a deeply felt and thought perspective that coherently connects all of the above. So you can't start with bits and pieces. If you just put bits and pieces on your vision statement, then that's not a philosophy of education. But if you've thought through all these things and then you put out something which comes out of that, then it's a philosophy of education. So that's my first question responded to. The second question, what is the need in the 21st century that schools must have a philosophy of education? Now that's a slightly more challenging question, and to that I'm going to resort to Krishnamurti, because I feel that among many of the thinkers, he's one person who actually looked squarely at what's happening in the world in the 20th century when he was alive, and he projected a lot of what might happen in the 21st century, what's happening to the human mind, to human values, and tried to respond to that at whatever depth he could. So for some of you who may not know who Krishnamurti was, a very quick sort of set of points. He was someone born in 1895. He lived almost the whole century. He was raised as a youth by Annie Besant, who probably more of you have heard about, to be a world teacher. He was groomed to be someone who would be like a Buddha or something like that. But he rejected that role at some point in his life, and he broke away from the Theosophical Society. That's quite a history of its own kind. And then he went on as an independent spiritual teacher. He traveled extensively across the world for over 70 years. And during that time, he engaged with thousands of people from different walks of life in different ways. He gave public talks, he had many dialogues and conversations, he had many question-answer sessions, he left behind a whole corpus of writings. And apart from that, his purpose in all this was to uncover, along with the others whom he was engaging with, certain factors which underlie the human condition, and to try and catalyze a certain renewal in human consciousness, which I'll come to again a little later. What did he mean by that? And in trying to do that, one of the things which was a very important thing for him was to start schools. He didn't want to start any ashrams. He felt the days of the ashrams was over. And it is really schools where anything new, any kind of renewal was possible. So in his lifetime, he helped start 7 schools, 5 in different places in India. And the oldest school of these is now 85 or 86 years old, which was in the place where I live, Rishi Valley. And the most recent one, which was much after his death, 6 years ago, there was a school called Pathshala, which started deep south of Chennai. And there's one school in the UK and one in California. Now, just stepping back a little, so what were some of the things which Krishnamurti saw happening in the 20th century, which was of great concern to him, and out of which his philosophy of education emerged? So these were closely observed by him, and among these was first, he saw the effects of competitive nationalism. He also lived through both the world wars, in fact he was during the Second World War, he was considered an undesirable alien and was not allowed to travel around, and was sort of interned in the US somewhere. He couldn't go anywhere because people thought he was speaking dangerous things at that time. He also saw economic domination of the corporations, how they were shaping lifestyles, consumerist values were gaining ground. And he also saw the danger of what religions had become. They had become dogmas, and there were lots of conflicts in religious ideas, and it was leading to many kinds of problems, including the kinds of terrorism that we have seen starting. He also noticed the rapid advances in technology, especially computer technology, but side by side with that, military weaponry. In fact, a lot of the initial research usually comes from defense research, and then it gets put into other things, including computers. You saw, of course, as some of you have mentioned, new forms of division, lots of violence and terror. He also noticed he was always extremely close to nature. His nature writings are among the most beautiful things you can read, where he writes about a tree or a field or a meadow. He had a very deep feeling for nature, and he could see the natural habitats being destroyed, cities growing, mega cities growing in an unplanned way, life forms becoming extinct, and all this to meet growing human populations. But much more than needs, it was to really satisfy human greeds, which were promoted in some way by the forms of economic production which had gained ground, by advertising, making you buy. This is today the way in which everyone thinks. I mean, you get constantly offers, buy this, buy that, buy that. And the effect of that is what we see around. And he also saw that the entertainment industry was capturing human minds. Both young as well as old. In fact, now many of our young people grow up what we call as digital natives. Many parents feel very proud of that. But actually something very dangerous is also happening side by side with that. Their minds are getting caught onto computer screens, smartphones, iPads and so on. And they're not looking out as much. So these were challenges of the 20th century. And how do we see these playing out now in the 21st century? Since I have undertaken to say the schools in the 21st century must have a philosophy of education. So first of all, if you look at a surface level, what are some of the trends in this very fast changing world? That's something which all of us agree, and we say we must have education which will meet the future. But what is that future? First, we see much greater mobility of people and ideas. People travel across, migrations, you can live in different parts of the world. Some people at least can, others are of course trapped where they originated. There are new technologies by the minute. People and businesses today are highly interconnected. Schools now are Wi-Fi enabled. There are smart classrooms. Students have iPads. Laptops are passé already. Information and knowledge, as many speakers have said, is available. Well, mouse is probably an outdated word. Click of the fingertip is probably more appropriate. Now we use just our fingers and thumbs. And there seem to be lots of new careers, new opportunities opening up, and yes, our schools probably need to respond to all of that. But side by side we find that nations, communities and individuals who are striving not to be left behind in this technology-driven age are becoming part of a competitive structure of rankings and rewards. This is happening at the global level. Countries are being ranked, within countries, states are being ranked, schools are being ranked. They have hundreds of magazines which conduct surveys and say number 1, number 2, and schools are now vying to try and sort of rise that ladder. And that's a effect which this whole 21st century development has had. Question that could be asked is this highly interconnected, digital, urban, technological future for all, is it a possibility or is it a fantasy? Is it a possibility for a few and a fantasy for everyone else? Or is it something which is leading to much worse side effects than we can probably... So I think we really need to look a little bit beyond what is visible on the digital surface. It's all about digital India now, but what is being neglected, what is being ignored, what is being created as just mass imagery, and underneath that there are all kinds of problems lying buried. So some of the real challenges which I think if we just open our eyes and look at them, they are visible. They are accelerating impacts from the 20th century. It's nothing very new, but they're taking new forms. We are all aware now of climate change. Till about 10 years ago, no one knew what climate change was. But we're all feeling the effects now. There are extreme weather conditions, rise in sea levels. Goa probably hasn't experienced it yet, but Bombay, Chennai, all along the coast of North America, there are storms which are now much faster. And many of the island nations are worried now that they will soon be under the sea. There's continued destruction of habitats, extinction of species. There's a shrinking of livable land. There are shortages of drinking water. Basic necessities of life are becoming more and more difficult. Clean air, uncontaminated food. We all are worried about what kind of food we are eating today. Is it healthy? Or has it got pesticides in it? Or is it being grown in such a way that the nutrients are lost? Or it's packaged and processed in a way that is no longer healthy? There's of course a lot of displacement of groups, of people. There's increased terrorism. And there is a refugee crisis in different parts of the world. Europe, what we heard some time back, now in our own neighborhood there is this refugee crisis. There's a lot of political, economic, social and religious uncertainty. In fact, no one knows really what's going to happen. In fact, we look at the political situation today, There's growing inequalities in our society. There are random acts of violence, daily occurrence almost in the papers, including sexual violence. Why are we so worried about our children today? And it's not just girls. Boys seem to be equally vulnerable. There's a lot more anxiety on all these fronts. And I think people who think a little bit about these things have lost faith in leaders, less of a hope for looking up to leaders, since leaders themselves have proved to be part of the problem. Okay, look at the leadership in the world today. Where are they taking the ship of the world? So that's something which now I think comes back, therefore the responsibility comes back to each one of us in some way. And this is something which I think Krishnamurti never tired of pointing out, that it's each of us individuals, and how do we grow up, how are we educated, how are we brought up, which will make any difference to what happens in the future. So these are some of the challenges of the 21st century. Now, I'd like to briefly pause, and you remember in philosophy of education I said a view of human nature and our responsibility to society is one part of it. It's difficult to explain all of Krishnamurti's sort of thought process on this, but I'll try and say it in a synoptic way, see whether you can make some sense of it and whether it resonates with you in any way. So, I think one of his central, what I would say, insights as a spiritual being was that you are the world. You are not different from the world. You know, we all think of ourselves as separate individuals, each one separate and then trying to relate. But he held and maintained and lived, perhaps, with the idea that all human beings share a common consciousness. And that the individual, what we call the individual, is just a layer on top of that, which is conditioned by family, by society, and by education. We saw different ways in which it could be conditioned by education. The one in the cartoon strip was one way in which the individual gets created, who becomes then part of society. But there could be other ways too. So most individuals therefore grow up in some kind of fragmentation and conflict within themselves. There's a certain unease. We are out of harmony with within ourselves. And when we are out of harmony within ourselves, and when we form groups, and we put our identity or, see ourselves as Hindus, or we see ourselves as even Indians, then there is immediately some division from those who are not us. And conflicts, internal conflicts, which then magnify into external conflicts and are set in motion. So the root cause of violence, according to Krishnamurti, was within individuals, it was between people, between social groups and nations. It was a fragmentation in our own psyche. But then he believed that this is not the natural condition of human beings. This is the way we had somehow structured our lives and world and so on, and things could be very different. So what were some of the things he suggested? I think, and this is why he traveled all over the world, talked to people. I think he tried to bring about what you would call a certain self-awareness. He said every human being has a capacity for self-awareness, be in touch with your own nature and see how your thoughts and feelings are coming up, how they are getting formed, what are their origins. And then you can become conscious of your conditioning, what society, family, education might be putting into you, you can become aware of it. And through attention, alertness, and finally right education, this conditioning may be helped to dissolve, or at least to become much less. Probably you can never get rid of conditioning, but it can become something which doesn't hold your mind in such a way that you are behaving in a compulsive way. And then we can discover one's true individuality. You may have special, as someone mentioned, your own talents, your own grain, ways in which you can contribute to others and to the world. And there could be a transformation then in your relationships, and you feel connected to and responsible then for humanity and for nature, not just for your child, not just for your family, not just for your class of children whom you're teaching, but a much wider sense of responsibility could come about. Now I'd like to maybe have Krishnamurti himself speak a little bit for a short while. So this is a film of Krishnamurti when he was towards the later part of his life. He's 88 years old now, and someone puts this question to him: "Sir, what is right education?" And we have a response. He uses a metaphor of two horses trotting together. I'll just mention what you will hear. The academic, technological proficiency, which he didn't deny. He said, yes, you need to be good. You need to have a good intellect and a good mind. But along with that, an understanding of the psyche and the process of living. That's far more important. And he talks about adults and children observing themselves together, exploring their own behavior, and discovering a freedom from their conditioning. It's not that the adult can teach the child this, because you are as much conditioned as the child is. And education, therefore, is to bring into being a good human being. Let's go to the film.
Is there such a thing as right education?
Just have to turn the volume on.
Knowing what the world is, all the brutality and vulgarity, and all the terrible things that are happening. What is their future?
I'm sorry, here technology is letting us down. We're not getting the volume. We'll just see in a minute. If it doesn't come, we'll skip it. Huh?
Help the child to grow. Such a thing as right education.
Can you hear this at the back? Yes.
Knowing what the world is, the extraordinary brutality and vulgarity, and all the terrible things that are happening. What is their future? What does education mean? Linguistically, it means to help the child to grow, to understand, to comprehend the whole process of living. And he goes to school. There he is taught. He learns to memorize, really. So he gradually builds up a whole structure of memories along a particular line: doctor, engineering, philosophy, psychology, physicists, and so on. And the computers are taking the place of teachers. A computer can teach far better than an ordinary local teacher. On the computer can have the top teachers in their special subject. So they can learn from the computers. And the computer is becoming more and more superior to the human brain. And why should he, please just listen first, why should he carry all the encyclopedic knowledge about one subject or the other and retain all that in his brain? Is that education? And that's what we are cultivating more and more and more. And also, we are neglecting totally the whole psychological world, the whole world of the psyche. Right? This is what is happening. One side, you have an extraordinary development in technology, whether it's science, biochemistry, or genetic engineering, or a top surgeon. Right? You have that extraordinary field, highly cultivated, more and more. and the other side of the human being, which is far more important. You understand? This is far more important. That is neglected, denied, let's say that's not important. So, what is right education? Is it not both the cultivation of a brain that can function excellently in the world, and also psychologically understand the whole meaning of existence, the self, the I, the psyche? Couldn't these two go together? Like two well-trained horses trotting along harmoniously together. You understand? And apparently that's one horse is highly developed, the other is still a baby, a foal. And right education seems to be not only academic training, but you have to have a job. You may have a job only for work 2 hours if the computers become more and more important. You'll have more and more leisure. That's taking place already. And that leisure is going to be used exploited by the entertaining and industry. More and more that's going to happen. Obviously, you can see it's happening now. So how does one, apart from the academic affair, how does one become a good human being? Right? You are asking the question. I'm not asking this question. I'm no children, but I meet hundreds of children all over the world. They go to various schools and so on. It's your children, not mine. You have to listen to this, find out. So how am I having few children, knowing they're going to be conditioned by other children, knowing that in a school they're all going to be conditioned. The newspapers, the magazines, the books, the history books, my country and opposed to your country, my kings are better than your kings, all that nonsense that goes on. And how am I, as a parent, to bring about a good mind, a good brain, a good human being? The word good has several meanings. It's an old-fashioned word, which is
Okay, we'll stop there and just take it to, I see time is running short, so we'll just run a few slides down to economize that. Can you just go down 3 or 4 slides? Go beyond this. Yeah. I just want to come to curriculum and pedagogy. Okay, stop there, yeah. Go back. Go back to the beginning of this. So there was a section in between where I think I'm not going to put it so heavily for you, where the aims of education were unpacked a little bit in more detail. But I'd like to just quickly go to what are some of the implications for curriculum and pedagogy for a school which is trying to work out a whole philosophy of education. And here I would in fact summarize a lot of things which have been said by other speakers, as well as which not just Krishnamurti, many other thinkers and schools have been working with. And yeah, sorry, this is, oh, it all came together, is it? Okay, let it all come together. So one aspect of this whole thing is, I'm sorry. I'm getting confused with the, forward and back. Okay, now I'm there. Yeah. So, I think one very important thing to realize is that to bring up a child, especially young children, awakening of their senses is very important. Very quickly, if we narrow them down into the intellectual 3 R's, there's a lot that gets lost. And contact with nature as part of our curriculum is a very important aspect of their upbringing. As well as what many other speakers have said, developing their aesthetic sensibilities through crafts, fine arts, performing arts, including drama, is something which is well worth putting as part of your curriculum. Then in terms of the development of the body, which is also very important, I think an approach which is enjoyment of body work, developing of physical agility and skills, rather than specialized competitive sports, I think a wholesome school needs to focus on that. Outside school, perhaps children could, excel in various areas and, go for various competitions. But I think if a school's ethos is not highly competitive, then it doesn't set up stars and, the highs and lows and create a certain different ethos. Also, learning practical skills of working with the land, water, food, energy are going to become more and more important. And I think, as was shown in one of the earlier films, looking at issues of pollution, garbage, waste management, these are all practical applications of curriculum which are going to become more and more necessary. In fact, how to regenerate landscapes which are already being poisoned, that's also going to become more and more important. Then cultivation of the mind, of course, is important. And this could be done in a variety of ways. Individualized learning of concepts and skills, but also learning to work with others, learning from each other, taking up projects which are in the real world. Then emphasis on dialogue and discussion rather than on knowledge transmission is a more appropriate way for children to be thinking beings, people who are thinking things through, are able to communicate, able to understand each other. And a judicious use of technology is not something to be avoided, but to be used judiciously rather than be driven by technology, which is one thing which there's a whole trend now to be driven by technology. Something new comes in, how do we make it part of schools? And companies are trying to push that quite a bit, corporations. Then very, very important, and this is what Krishnamurti was referring to towards the end of what we saw. He spoke a little bit more about it, but I thought I'll cut it short. Growth of the heart, which is learning to cooperate rather than compete, concern for the well-being of others and one's own, rather than a tendency towards individualistic isolation, which is what the modern school of the 20th century seemed to inculcate more than anything else. So these are some principles which I would say. Many of our schools are somewhere in between. We believe in many of these things, but our structures and practices still reflect, I would say, the older kind of schooling which we have inherited. So there are some suggestions now in the last 2-3 slides for school management, administrators and teachers for making small shifts which can be made. So what each school management can do, one is put in place robust means of communication and forums of discussion among all stakeholders, because all these are partners together in the education of the child. The administrators, the teachers, the parents and the students. And one could probably include also the support staff, because every school has that constituency too. So to have good communication channels, get feedback, understand and try and work a certain common approach out is one thing which school managements could strive for. Collectively examine the nature of relationships, what are the kinds of reward structures as well as teaching practices, the types of connections between teachers and also between teachers and students, between teachers and parents, and also the whole area of parenting. Schools can't not be involved in some way with parent education too. And the aim, at least I feel, should be to move towards a more fear-free, supportive learning environment, provide richer and more challenging learning opportunities of the kind that have been discussed by many of the speakers in the previous sessions, details of which I will not go into. Connect with other schools. I think this conference provides one such forum, but have as many such things connect with other schools, share, exchange practices, learn about each other. Because schools, in fact, some way are collectively raising the next generation. And we can't be moving in very different directions. At least we should not be moving in very different directions. And I hear at least that Agrusa was partly founded with that kind of aim in mind. Discuss also broader issues such as the school's connections with society, the local environment, with nature. How can the school be an active participant in that rather than a kind of gated community which doesn't bother with what's going on outside its gates? And the aim could be to develop a coherent philosophy of education with its aims from the perspective of the 20th century. Not a surface view of the 21st century, but I think a much deeper view is needed of what's happening to us, what's happening to the world, what's happening to the human mind, and what's happening to other life forms. And therefore enable shifts in values and practices that derive from all of this. That's for the school managements to think about. Second, what can administrators do in a school? Because you're directly involved with the community which is there in your care. Once again, put in place systems that ensure that every student feels recognized and known by the adults. No one is an anonymous presence. The Steiner School has a wonderful way of making sure that every child is known very closely by at least a few adults. But it could happen in a much larger school also. There can be systems and practices. In fact, some of these points emerged after discussing with an educator uncle of mine who used to run very large schools, whose son happens to be sitting here. Promote higher academic goals than merely exam-driven learning. So this is on the side of academics. But apart from academics, provide as many opportunities as feasible for all students to participate in co-curricular, socially relevant and nature-based activities. Because this brings out the hidden talents. Everyone is not talented in academics, and if you put everyone through that particular grind, then you're going to lose a lot of human potential. Build in expectations from coordinators and teachers of responding to students' needs, emotional and academic, as a primary part of their role, and not just driving them through the syllabus, curriculum, textbook, and so on. Encourage an ethos of cooperative working and sharing among teachers at different levels. And provide a fair-minded leadership. This is very, very important, without becoming authoritarian. Because if there are pockets in school, some people feel they have the ear of the administration, others they feel they don't, and that kind of thing happens, and the whole culture gets vitiated. So a certain fair-mindedness in the administration also leads to fair-mindedness in teachers and the way students view the adults in the school. And it's not a very easy thing to achieve all of these that I'm saying. I would say all schools have challenges with these. Be clear and alert in responding to negative pressures from parents and other stakeholders. So be very clear what you want for the children in your school, and don't get driven by market forces, by parents' unreasonable expectations. You have to educate the parents rather than be driven by them. This is of course for management as much as for the administrators. Finally, what can individual teachers do? Many of you are individual teachers, so what can you do? One, develop your own clarity of purpose and hold wider goals in teaching students. That's what many of the speakers in the morning have spoken about. You have a lot of power in your hands. You have a direct impact on students. So your own thinking about your role as a teacher, I think, needs to undergo its own self-education in some way. And to continue to widen your purposes, to have a deep connect with students. Nurture your own humanity and concern for reaching out to students as persons rather than as a roll number or someone whose marks you have to add up and so on. Foster supportive and cooperative relationships among the students in your classes, because that's one of the aims of education now, that you really have to live in a cooperative society. I mean, the workplace demands it. People work in teams now much more than one boss dictating things. You have to be much more flexible. But far more than that is a wider sense of cooperation among people, in your families, in the community, and so on. And remain alert again. You see, just like the administration and management will feel pressures from outside, teachers can feel pressures from colleagues. So there could be inhibiting, discouraging influences from colleagues or administrators without feeling isolated. Somewhere you have to remain in communication, some discussion, try and shift things. Even there's a lot of change which can be brought from the ground. Good ideas can emerge from teachers which then administrators and management might also feel like implementing. And try generating a positive influence on other colleagues. I don't know what that, I think some mistakes. Students would then experience better relationships in school where fear is not the primary driver of learning. It will not be like Prosenjit Ganguly's experience which he captured in the animation. So, something to say, suppose a school does develop its own philosophy. There is some cautionary note here also. Now this philosophy has to be a philosophy in practice. It has to be something which has to weave itself into the overall culture of the school. So, first of all, it should be clear about its aims. Its aims are to prepare students to face the challenges of the world creatively. As Mr. Deepak said, it's the age of creativity, and it's always the need for certain intelligence in being able to do this, and bring about smaller and bigger shifts in society. The school really needs to serve that purpose now in the 21st century. It can't be subject to society, it has to bring changes in society. Which means you'll have to work against the grain of society and the contemporary world, and that creates its own pressures and challenges on you, and so a certain demand on being clear internally and amongst yourselves is very important. So therefore there's a need for re-education, a periodic renewal of purpose among administrators, teachers and parents. So one can't say that I have now reached it. I have to continually respond, evolve and deepen. And in order to sustain themselves, these schools will need to see that people in the schools are inquiring and thinking. They are living this philosophy in practice. If you just create a mission statement or a vision statement and then say everyone should follow this, it becomes an ideology. And then it's very difficult to implement because internal changes haven't happened in people. And then there's more conflict of a different kind. So it has to be a philosophy in practice rather than in ideology. And then it can be, as many have mentioned, the schools which have really found that energy to do this. It can be a real source of creativity and joy for both children and adults. These schools would be then places you would really love to go and work in. You'll never regret being a teacher. And I would say, so many of our speakers have spoken about that feeling which draws us to the life of a school. But one more caution. It can also be very hard to sustain since frustrations, struggles, conflicts, feelings of being up against too many odds may also arise. One may also have our own fears and anxieties. So to acknowledge those, to live with those, and yet not to give in to those, I think is very important. And finally, I would say it's an absolute necessity for our very survival in the 21st century. I think that's, to me, the key thing here, that schools have to change if human beings and other life forms have to survive this century. It's only the second decade of 21st century, but the trends are not very optimistic. And with that, I'm sorry I'm ending on that kind of a note, but there is an optimism with me. I see many changes now happening. Schools are doing very many more things than they used to do earlier. They're also connecting with each other and sharing many things. And with that, I'd like to say thank you.